Well, good afternoon, Flagstaff. Welcome to the next installment of the Flagstaff Career Exploration Series. I'm your host, Paul Kolpinski, and before I introduce our guest this afternoon, I want to have a special message to high school seniors out there in Flagstaff. Arizona Gear Up developed the Senior Launch Guide as a practical resource for teachers, parents, and counselors to help you navigate the many unfamiliar steps to successfully transition from high school onto your career path that you're choosing after graduation. The guide includes checklists for the most of the career training and education that you might need. There's also information and forms for completing the FAFSA, applying for scholarships and jobs, selecting and applying for colleges, and so much more. So you can go to this website, and I'll post it on the comment section down below once we're done with the interview today. But if you go to this URL, you can get more information about the Senior Launch Guide from Arizona Gear Up in collaboration with Northern Arizona University. So, without any further ado, I would like to introduce our guest for this afternoon. I know you're going to be excited to talk with our guest about the research and the work that he's doing. It's amazing. Dr. Erin Taber is a biomedical science researcher, author, and educator. Among the many things he's engaged in, he conducts research focused on human translational modalities, and we'll find out what that actually means in a moment. He's worked on numerous industry-driven projects with cosmetic procedures, wound healing, cardiovascular studies, strokes, and catheter redesigns. He has a doctorate in translational biological sciences from Northern Arizona University. His other educational experience includes degrees in health and clinical pathology. He's held full-time positions at Coconino Community College and Northern Arizona University. He's received nominations for his outstanding work as an educator, not only at the collegiate level, but also for his work with high school students through the Caveat program here in Flagstaff. And Dr. Taber, Erin, I'm going to call you. Thank you for joining us. And currently, you're also pursuing your master's in business administration.
Definitely. Education's a lifelong endeavor.
Yeah, it seems that obviously you demonstrate the evidence of the fact that education is important to you. So can you start us off by talking about how you see the value of the education that you've received translating into the work that you're doing today?
Definitely. I think there's formal education, and then when you move into the workforce, you realize what you actually don't know. And then there's on-the-job education, and then there's this interface between the two that exists. And I've been able to take that formal training through the years of the collegiate onboarding, is what I'll call, and then move that into the workforce sector, whether that be higher ed itself in classic academic research facilities or in the industry sector and working with a number of companies and clinical facilities. So it's ongoing. It's never going to stop. And I think it's something that everybody needs to aspire to.
So when you think about the sorts of things you were interested in when you were young, in middle school and high school, are there things that you can point to that say, hey, this has kind of led me down this path, or did you even think you were going to be doing this work?
That's a loaded question there, because I knew I always wanted to be working in human medicine. I didn't realize it would ever take the path that it has to date. So I had originally from, 6th, 7th grade, and I had a very influential teacher at that time. His name was Dr. Dwayne Priester, Mr. Priester, Dr. Priester, we called him in middle school. And, I remember talking to Dr. Priester many times about wanting to be a clinical physician and specifically being a pediatric oncologist or a kid's cancer doc. And as life has it, it turns and weaves and presents all kinds of unique opportunities. And here I am many years later after those 7th grade classes with Dr. Priester. And I consider myself very, very fortunate to be working around clinicians, be side to side with them in many days, seeing patients with those clinical physicians, but definitely took a different route than what I originally thought. But, at the end of the day, I'm still what I would consider in the medical field to a degree, and that fulfills me heavily.
So we're talking with Dr. Erin Taber. He's a biomedical science researcher, author, and educator. And we're taking your questions during the interview this afternoon. You can type your question into the comment box on either YouTube Live or Facebook Live, and we'll take your question to Dr. Taber and answer your questions about career paths in biomedical science, biomedical research, all of the components that we're going to be able to talk about today. Because, I think you can probably talk about a lot of things that are in this field. So one of the things that I'm curious in, the notion of this translational biological science. What does that actually mean?
So the way I described it, and I get this question a lot from my students, whether it be the high school students or the classic collegiate student, where it's, well, what do you mean you're a biologist? That's kind of this umbrella or blanket term that we think about. And, to further classify that, you kind of have to specify what you do. There's classic ecologists, there's squirrel ecologists that get specific. And then there's, individuals that study cancer biology. And I'm an individual that looks kind of at a broader scale how novel technologies translate to human medicine. How can we take those and move them into the human sector? So many times you might have heard the saying from benchtop to bedside, and that's kind of an analogy that we live by in this field, where we're always looking at innovations or ideas and how that could be used in orthopedic applications, cosmetic applications, cardiology applications, you name it. So that whole gamut of translational medicine, how it translates from sort of that innovation stage to then human application. And that's sort of where my training lies, and that's kind of where my brain likes to really reside.
So from a practical standpoint, what does your day often look like? Are you spending time behind a microscope? Are you, what do you do in that case?
All of the above, and that's why I love this job. It's, my day is never the same, ever, ever, ever. And, I consider myself a jack of many disciplines, in the sense that there might be instances where I'm on the phone with a physician. We had a call with a physician earlier this week regarding a wound care case that we've been following. There's been times where I've been in the clinic. So here I am with a patient in the room or an operating room. There are times where I'm in the lab or a clean room. There are times where I'm in a suit and tie at a podium giving a talk. So at any given stage, it really is all facets. And I think that's why I really appreciate this field, is that it's not monotonous. Every day is vastly different, and every day definitely creates some new challenges, though.
So can you speak more to the various things that you do? Because you're on boards, you teach, you're in the lab, you're writing. How, obviously, are you doing like a little of that, a little of everything throughout the day, or do you kind of segment even your month or your week to manage all of those things?
No, and that's a great question. And one of the strategies that I use and that I impart on folks that ask me this question, and you can look it up online, and I have to give credit where credit is due. I had an advisor, and he's actually now a retired NAU professor and completely out of my discipline, but a near and dear friend and former advisor, Dr. Sylvester Allred. And Dr. Allred was a squirrel ecologist. Now he writes children's books in retirement. So he has been a very big influence in my life. And why I bring him up is he imparted this rule, and the rule was the rule of 168. And it's a time management strategy kind of rule, if you will, where there's 168 hours in a week, and you break down your week based on personal time. So, there's got to be time for family, friends, hobbies, so forth. There's got to be time for professional side, schooling side, so forth. And I use that rule of 168 to kind of manage the load that I have. Can I take on a new task, a new endeavor, a new project? Or how do I divvy out, to your question, Paul, the time for textbook writing? We're writing a textbook chapter right now. How do I divvy out time for laboratory procedures? How do I divvy out time for board meetings? You name it. And that rule of 168 is kind of the guiding principle. And to this day, thanks to Dr. Allred, I still use that rule, and not as rigorously, on a week-to-week basis, but I would say about every month I'm revisiting that. And I definitely teach it to folks who come to me that ask that, well, how the heck do I manage my time? Here, use this rule of 168. And I help, coach my students through that. So it's really fun, and it's a neat way to pay it forward too to Dr. Allred.
So do you have any guidelines that you use to say, okay, 20% of my week is dedicated to this, 60% is dedicated to that? Do you have some rules?
Definitely. And some of it, and I'll be selfish for a moment, I think you have to have an intrinsic or like component with it. If I'm not actively interested, or I might think it's kind of boring, or this might not get the brain juice flowing, there's not going to be as much allocation in that 168 hours as something that would do that. So I think it's important for me, at least, everybody might be different on this, but I have to like it. I have to be actively wanting to learn it, or actively wanting to devote time to it, to make it that bigger chunk of percentage to your question there.
So Stephen Covey has this notion of like sharpening the saw, right? Where you're doing the self-improvement. Mm-hmm. So when you look at education, sometimes education can be sharpening the saw, but sometimes education is kind of your job, right?
Yeah.
Do you have advice that you give students as to how you manage when you're a full-time student? How do you manage that piece?
So one thing that I do, Paul, is each year I look at kind of a big picture, a big weakness that I have. And case in point, you mentioned the fact that I'm going back to school. And I'm going back to school vastly different than I ever have before. And that's solely because when I got into more of a leadership role in the industry sector and started seeing not so much scientific or translational processes, but actual business processes, I went, oh my gosh, there's a weakness here. So it was something that I went, how do I bolster that? And in this case, there's a couple options. One, it's go get formal training. Two, it's time on the job. Well, I'm relatively new at this, so my time on the job isn't really that luxury that I have. So I had to go find another means to do that. So to your question, I'm always looking at, I'm a big martial artist, so we call it sharpening the sword, per se, instead of sharpening the saw. But those are things where you acknowledge a weakness, and then you find ways to go, well, how can I bolster that weakness? And when you're in that role of student, of whatever it is, you admit that there's the weakness there. And I think, at least for me, that allows me to be open to how do I improve it. So does that answer that one?
Yeah, no, that's really good because it's a fluid process. I know for me,
yeah.
It changes depending on what the priorities are on a given day or a given week or a given month, right? So it's a matter of revisiting it all the time.
Definitely.
So we're talking to Dr. Erin Taber. He's a biomedical science research author and educator. We're taking your questions. Type your questions into the comment box, and we'll be able to forward those questions on to Erin. So Erin, back to the idea of your MBA and the business side of things, because from a researcher standpoint, you're you're in the lab, you're developing these things, but in order for them to get to me in the hospital, they have to go through the business side of the equation. And it seems like that's a big transition that you're realizing today as to how do I take all this research that I've been working on and actually bringing it to actual benefit for patients, right?
Oh, definitely.
Can you say more about what your discovery is around that transition?
Absolutely. And Paul, I think I'll add one more component to that too. And again, this was a complete weakness. It's never easy to go into a lab and create a novel process. There's definitely brain power. There's a lot of hours invested in that. But that's about as far as I was taking it. And then, you would pass it off to somebody. Now, seeing it from the other side of the coin, where you're coming into a business side and you're seeing technologies that from a R&D perspective have already been developed. Now your goal is to take that all the way through a regulatory approval process that has the FDA involved, that has all these agencies and rules and regulations, in addition to a business model. So for me, as I moved into this position, and I'm with a company that works in regenerative medicine, and it's really neat because we take from labor and delivery wards, we take a portion of the placenta, and then we take the cells out of the placenta, and then we create a fluid application for orthopedic injections for individuals that might have arthritis or chronic and inflammatory diseases there. So we're really looking at the ankle, taking this product that we've created all the way through this process. And in doing so, there's those heavy business components. And I went, oh my gosh, if I'm going to be charged with creating massive spreadsheets that are going to be cost analysis programs and budgets for 7 years and enrolling patients in varying phases of clinical trials, I need to have some business backing there. So that was sort of the initial inclination to begin looking at this. And, I sought out the advice of a number of advisors and friends and folks, and some people were saying, no, you don't need it, learn on the job. And, I kind of made that pro and con list for me and said, the formal education route's what's going to be best. So, that's kind of what I went with.
Well, and you know what, it's interesting because you are so diverse. You're almost like a Renaissance man when it comes to all of this, right? Because, in many cases, the researchers leave it to the business people to figure out how to bring that to market, right? But what I love about you, knowing your varied interest, it's like you're constantly seeking to understand those nuances that are even outside of your comfort zone. So getting outside of your comfort zone is probably something that you've developed some skill set around.
Definitely. And, it is 100% a result of a team that we have too. So I need to give credit to the team that we have been able to build. And, it's a cliche saying, and everybody says it, but I truly walk it, where I don't know that. Let's bring in somebody who does. And then I'll learn from them. And I don't care what the individual title is. I don't care where the hierarchy lies within it. It's, you're better at that than me. Let's bring that person in and build a really cohesive, complete team. And I think that is what's fun about it for me too. It's always sparking that next interest and the ongoing, ever-evolving learning process. And that comes in a multitude of ways. So definitely, I pride myself in that being one of my qualities. Drives my wife crazy because she never knows what the heck is going on from week to week or the next endeavor. And my kids are always going, Dad, what the heck are you doing now? And there's times where they don't even know what Dad does or what he's working on. They just think I'm just this crazy mad inventor guy that's out there. And I like to think of it as the serial entrepreneur, but also in the sciences. So
can you think of was that something that you developed, or was it something that was always there that you just refined?
I think it was something that I fostered. I think there's always been that underlying, drive for what, how, why kind of thinking ideology, I had a number of people that fostered that through, I started with Dr. Priester in our call today, and then Dr. Allred, and I've had a number of advisors that have never critiqued or criticized me for that. They've actually encouraged it. So I think, to your question, it's always been there, and I've surrounded myself, whether by choice or chance, folks who have actually fostered that. So credit to them for allowing me, and really the pay it forward mentality. They developed it through me. So
yeah, and that's so important to have an adult mentor that isn't your parent, to help to cultivate those latent skills and attributes in us. So, would you have advice to a middle school student who might be struggling to maybe find that person, that mentor? Because usually it's the adult that has to find the student, right? Because that adult
right.
could be anyone. But when that student's going, who could my mentor be? Do you have some suggestions for that student?
Yeah, and forgive me for saying this, but a lot of times I think people are under this auspice that it has to be a teacher. It has to, and it doesn't. It really could be, the next door neighbor who happens to have a really cool job, or who's tinkering in their garage on a motorcycle, or, those are mentors. And pending, the parental caregiver, whoever that is, mom, dad, uncle, grandparent, it doesn't matter. As long as that parental individual is okay with that person being there, latch on and learn as much as you can. And you'd be surprised at how many times people want to give back, and how they really don't mind sharing knowledge. So my advice to anybody would be, don't think that advisor or mentor or friend or whatever you want to call them, it doesn't have to be that classic textbook individual. Go talk to your math or science teacher. It really could be, your best friend's parent or aunt or whoever it is. Everybody does have something to offer that within good guidance could be that individual. So that would be my best bet, is don't close my best bit of guidance would be, don't close the door on who that mentor could be, and really open your blinders to see it's really anybody out there that you seek that intrinsic active interest to.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that's exactly why we're doing this, to help expose students to pathways and fields of interest that they might not have otherwise had the opportunity to be exposed to. So we're talking to Dr. Erin Taber. He's a biomedical science researcher, author, and educator here in Flagstaff. We're taking your questions. If you have a question for Dr. Taber about anything that we've been talking about so far, type it into the comment box in either YouTube or Facebook, and we'll get that question to Dr. Taber. So here's a question. Erin, Trudy has a question that commenting on how many interests that you do have, and knowing that you talked about your 8th grade teacher, but did you have a favorite class in middle school or high school that stands out for you?
I did, and it's probably of no surprise. I took a AP Anatomy and Physiology course. I will tell everybody, probably shouldn't say this, and Paul, you might not like hearing this. I actually didn't like the teacher. But it was my favorite class. So Dr. Priester, Mr. Priester, who I was talking about earlier, I didn't like his class. I loved him. So this goes to my point earlier, is you never know who the advisor or mentor is going to be. He was actually my world history teacher. And I definitely, it's one of those that, yeah, it's interesting, but I love the sciences. So I had my instructor in this AP Anatomy and Phys course, and that was my favorite class, so that's what I was drawn to. But my favorite instructor, or the most influential instructor, came out of this world, geography, and frankly, I forget the name of the class, but it wasn't my favorite course.
So it's interesting because you're also an educator now, right?
Yeah.
And you can look back at those teachers where it's like, if only, right? But so you had a class where you didn't like the class, but you liked the teacher, and the reverse. Sometimes that struggle to get through the class is something that causes students to lose interest, right? So as an educator now, what advice would you have for a student who's in maybe either one of those positions? I can't stand the instructor, or I can't stand the content.
I love that question, because one thing I tell all of my students to this day, Paul, is be selfish. What can you get out of this class? You know, for me, Mr. Priester taught me how to study, taught me how to appreciate things that, you know, I was getting deeper lessons besides a world geography or world history textbook. There were much deeper lessons. And he opened, I think, you know, he did a good part of opening my eyes to that, but I think our class as a whole, you know, and you compare that to our anatomy and physiology class that I had, and it was very, very, very much, here's the textbook, and I loved it. But there wasn't those deeper lessons there. So what I tell my students today is how to walk that line between those two is be selfish. What can you gain, whether it be a deeper lesson or something that translates into your working daily world? You know, today, I can leave with this lecture, this material today, and use it. That's what I tell a lot of my preclinical courses with nurses or medical assistants that will soon be nurses. What are you leaving today that you can take into the work environment? And that's the take-home message for you. So it's self-centered a bit, but I think even if you look at it, the be selfish, there's a deeper lesson there, and some of them pick up on it. So it shows them that, to your point, whether you like it, like me, or you like the material, there's something here for you.
Yeah, and I've always found too, no matter how, even if the content is something I've heard before, I'm always looking for the one thing that I haven't heard before.
Yes.
Because if there's one thing and I take that away, it was time well spent, right?
Definitely.
And I think that's what your point is.
Definitely, yeah.
So here's another question from John on Facebook. He's thinking about what you talked about your path from your teacher, your 8th grade teacher, Dr. Priester, to today. And he wants to know, what was the biggest outlier of experience or some experience that you had that was maybe a seminal type of experience along the way that influenced your interest and career-wise, your interest?
So it's a story, and John, you might appreciate this because it actually didn't happen until years later. I was 17, and I knew at that point, you know, I still wasn't thinking about the current field that I'm in. I was looking at still pediatric oncology, and I was coming around, I don't know, junior, senior of high school at that point, and I was starting to look for summer internships. And you know, like anybody wanting to be a doctor, you go out and get volunteer experience, so forth. And I ended up getting a volunteer experience at the Mayo Clinic down in Scottsdale. I'm from the Phoenix area, so it was, you know, relatively close to home. And this was an experience that was incredibly profound. And my volunteer internship, I was assigned to the inpatient pharmacy. And in the inpatient pharmacy, I was specifically assigned to the chemotherapeutic areas. So these are the individuals and the farm techs that were making the chemotherapies. Pharmacists would, you know, review, sign off, and then the clinicians would go out and administer the chemo. And I got invited to go see a patient get administered this chemo. And it was the very first time of me walking into a patient external to family or friend. And that had a really profound event on me. And I won't go into the longevity of the story. We could draw this out for an hour. But that one event right there, knowing that, you know, this is my calling, it's to help folks in the clinical setting. That was the one instance that made that concrete or made that happen for me?
So
it's a great question.
You've also written that you aspire for your research to one day translate into improved bedside conditions for patients and the quality of care. So when you think about the future of the work that you're doing, what's the technology or what's the research pointing to that really excites you about actualizing that aspiration?
You know, and that another great question, Paul, and I alluded to it earlier, and that's regenerative medicine. And this is relatively new to me. You know, I did a lot of my doctoral work on regenerative therapies, and a fancy way to think of this is taking what already pre-exists in your body, barring no weird conditions, you know, cancer, so forth, and using what the body already has to repair what's broken. So for instance, the company that I'm working at right now, we're taking human placental tissues, you know, from individuals that donate them after a baby is delivered. And, you know, some cultures have ritualistic ceremonies, so forth. Other cultures just get rid of that and it gets medically incinerated. So here we're taking what one might argue as medical waste and turning it into a therapy which could help somebody repair their own body and reduce narcotic use, reduce, you know, wear and tear, regenerate joints and allow somebody to run another marathon or whatever it might be. But that's what really gets me jazzed or juiced today is those regenerative therapies.
So a student sitting in the classroom today thinking about this future and knowing that in 10 years it's going to be even vastly different from the way it is today, what are some of the things that they could be thinking about from their educational career path between 8th grade and a doctorate degree, or even just a senior in high school sitting around going, whoa, I'm interested in this? What are some educational things that are foundational to moving into this career path?
And it's, again, another cliche answer. So for the students on the call, forgive me because you've probably heard your teachers say this, but interdisciplinary work. You can't just be an engineer anymore. And I mean that very broad. You know, you can, and people do and have great careers at it. But where you see the forefront of these advances occurring is interdisciplinary work. So combinations of biology and engineering, biology and chemistry, biochemistry and engineering. So you really need to be taking those foundational disciplines and seeing how they intertwine, interweave, and work together. That is the best bit of advice that I could tell anybody is begin to see those overlaps, not look at independent disciplines there. And I'll leave it with this on your comment, Paul. I often get asked by students, you know, that are coming into school, well, I'm getting a bio degree. Why the heck do I have to take these 5 chemistry classes? And it's to this very point. You're missing the ability to see that overlap, that interconnectedness. And it's very important to begin to see those interdisciplines.
Kind of like using your martial arts and physical therapy interest, or excuse me, and physical fitness interest. It's kind of like cross training instead of becoming just a marathon runner.
Exactly. Yes, definitely. Yeah.
So what are some other career possibilities for students to also consider in this whole field that's still even developing? You know, there are probably jobs that have yet to be invented, right? But what are some opportunities for students?
You know, one that I love to point out, and, you know, you talked about it earlier, I had this awesome experience to work with the Caveat School District in town here. And I had, for 2 or 3 years, a group of students that would come through and learn bioscience techniques. And it was incredibly cool to teach high school students. But then within this class, we got to go out and experience all kinds of different bioscience disciplines. And there was one that really came around multiple times that got all of the students interested. And this was a bioscience clinical laboratory technician, or a clinical scientist. And it's even different than what I do. So, we would go up to the hospital here in town, and we would take, the classic tour, and you think about your classic nurse, you think your classic doctor, physical therapist, but then we get funneled into the clinical laboratory. And in this laboratory, you've got urinalysis machines that are testing urine. You've got, blood banks. You've then got your entire histology department that's looking at cancerous or potentially cancerous tissues coming directly out of the OR. And these are the people that are working in the clinical sector, but doing laboratory-based techniques. And there's doctors in there. There is nurses in there. And these are people that never interact with a patient. So it's a way for us to begin to broaden our horizon on even what the clinical sciences are. So don't think of just the doctor, the nurse as your classic, they're administering drugs or writing the scripts. These are folks that have zero patient interaction, but they're the ones looking in the microscope. They're the ones making the microscopy slides. They're the ones checking the urine. So I always like to point that one out because it's often overlooked, and it's not the most novel by any means, Paul, but I think it often gets swept under the rug or not taught about as a career option. And there's great careers there that have long-lasting effects and definitely clinical impact.
Awesome. Dr. Erin Taber, biomedical science researcher, author, educator, board member, community member, dad, athlete, all around good guy. Thank you so much for spending some time with us this afternoon to share about your career path and the advice that you have, because as you were mentioning, that mentorship can start just even through this interview. So thank you for offering your time to do that today. Definitely.
And if anybody on the call has any questions or wants to reach out, by all means, I'm available. So
okay, I'll put them in touch with you.
All right. Thanks so much, Paul.
All right. Thanks, Erin.
Bye, everybody. Have a good one.
Bye-bye. So I want to remind you, high school seniors, listen up. Reminder of the Gear Up Senior Launch Guide as a resource for you to take the next step in your career path, your educational career path, as you get ready for graduation and you think about what's going to be happening next year. This guide is free. It's at this URL, and it includes checklists and all the things that you're going to need to make sure that you've hit them. And even if you are well into this, get the guide anyway. It's free, and you can make sure that you're hitting all the right points. And then also join us next week. Our guest next week is going to be Aaron Stump. He's the owner of 316 Motorworks and Randy's Downtown Garage. And he's going to be talking with us about starting a successful business in Flagstaff, and more specifically, information about the automotive repair and fabrication business. So that's going to be next week here on YouTube Live and Facebook. Next Thursday, May 14th at 3 p.m. So look forward to seeing you then. Until then, have a great week.